It seems that Rousseau's literary position in late 18th century is located at a crossroads, especially when we consider the treatment of the visual paradigm that, as described by Chris Jenks, motivates enlightened ambition to reveal evident truth. On the one hand, Rousseau obviously shares the heritage of enlightened anthropology, which underlies the age of sensibility. Drawing on the Cartesian method, the epistemological optimism suggests a perfect insight into the object of cognition, which can be gained by deducing from reason to effect. The result would be self-evident truth, which has been made visible by the light of reason. So, man and his nature, understood as a machine mouvante, can be read by using indexical codes, reducing the unity of body and mind to a conditional pattern of stimulus and reaction. The ethical impact of the homme sensible, his sincerity and virtue, is based on the undeniable reliability of his machine, a highly delicate sensorium whose inner dynamics can, however, be illustrated. Even though sensualism and empirism claim to be against Descartes, it seems to me that the concept of the homme sensible connects to the empirical aspects of Descartes' method. On the other hand, Rousseau's writing is characterized by decisive moments in which he transforms this epistemological optimism about the evidence of human nature as articulated in the visual paradigm. These changes already announce the imminent romanticism of Rousseau's mental universe. Monglot, in particular, has extrapolated une sensibilité romantique in the second half of the 18th century, also in relation to Rousseau's Julie. In order to consider Rousseau's threshold status in this respect, let's have a short look at Caspar David Friedrich's well-known Der Wanderer über dem Nebelmeer, a painting from around 1818 that depicts an essential situation of the Romantic view. Although David is attributed to the German Romantic period, his painting gives us some decisive hints for tracking the modification of the visual paradigm at the end of the 18th century in France. What is depicted here illustrates the romantic notion of the corresponding landscape as accurately studied by Rainer Warning, for example. The wanderer, holding a superior position on a rock, contemplates a landscape formed by smaller rocks, trees, an open field, and distant mountains in the background. The wanderer's superior position accentuates the opposition of the human subject and of nature, his intimate counterpart. The wanderer's synoptic view, as attributed by his superior position, articulates the constituting moment of the reassuring correspondence between the man and his natural surroundings. The correspondence is based on the very possibility of contemplating nature as if it were one's own soul. Romantic correspondence presupposes the optimism of being able to identify oneself even in the most pain-ridden moments, to recognize oneself and one's own nature in real nature as in a true mirror, as Gerhard Hess has pointed out. This, so to call metaphysical dynamic, assures personal and existential reintegration. The destabilized subject can come back to Mother Nature, as Stravinsky calls it, and find a place in the universal harmony which binds all beings together in a kind of analogia entis. In the late Rousseau, in the Réflexions d'un promeneur solitaire, we have a lot of those corresponding landscapes. Aside from the moment of existential saturation and sovereign overview, rooted in the synoptic ability of the wanderer, there's another striking aspect to the painting. There are many contrasts in color of bright and dark parts. The wanderer looks at a kind of bottomless abyss, partly covered by mist. He stands at the very edge of the rock, as if on a threshold to a space that seems to vanish in the distant background, also on a temporal threshold at sunset between day and night. These elements of the painting articulate a troubling moment of uncertainty, an unreachable dimension that is unattainable to the spectator's view. Nature is not only hidden in some parts and unrecognizable, it is also removed, mysteriously veiled. With Friedrich's painting in mind, let us return to Rousseau, for whom successful insight into human nature is not as certain as enlightened anthropology might suggest. He is interested in exploring the difficulties in conceptualizing man by patterns of evidence. Rousseau deals with the Cartesian heritage, the indexicality of the sensitive soul, and introduces dark aspects and opaque gray zones which disturb the ideology of anthropological evidence. His epistolary novel, Julie ou la Nouvelle Héloïse, is located at the threshold between sensibilité and pre-romantic writing. It focuses on abysmal aspects of this soul that the subject has to face and to deal with in a world of visibility that is still impregnated by indexical thinking. Today, I will illustrate how Rousseau introduces structures of obscurity in the ideology of nature and evidence, as seen in the regime of virtue. This line of reasoning argument leads to the proposal that the subject's strategies of hiding and transforming its epistemological darkness in the penetrating regime of virtue create central aspects of the romantic or the pre-romantic mind, such as nostalgia, mournfulness, and longing desire. My argument tries to explore in particular to what extent the strategy of dealing with unattainable aspects of inwardness creates and supports a rhetorical dimension of the text, articulated in obscure zones of ambivalent, diffused, or veiled meaning. This rhetorical dimension seems to me the essential channel of communication used by the epistolary novel between the protagonist and the reader. So I come to my first point. The love wound as lost origin and the letter as supplement. The starting point of my argument is when Saint-Preux first falls in love with Julie. The first encounter constitutes a key moment that generates a self-refuting dynamic. Vos attraits avaient ébloui mes yeux. Julie's overwhelming virtue shines from her in such a manner that Saint-Preux is blinded. The transparence of Julie's being, her self-identity, which she develops as an admirable accomplishment, thus causes its very opposite, bringing unevenness to the logical and evident surface of human nature that seem to be captured by deducible mechanisms. The undermining dynamic described gains a peculiar power of its own that leads into darkness. It opens an area that rejects being evidenced or illuminated at all. So the text articulates a turning point when self-identity and semantic transparence turn unpredictably into a destructiveness that effects the loss of sense and meaning. Virtue is then threatened in and by its own existence, causing blind furor, passion. Rousseau's discourse of love is essentially characterized as a generator of this self-refuting agency. In initializing the conflict, which has been described as a hindered love, blocked by social prejudice, Rousseau exposes the actual problem of which love serves as a mere illustrator. In virtue grows the germ of death and self-destruction, the anéantissement of all meaning. Virtue is also no more as transparent a concept as it was supposed to be. Within this malignant dynamic of virtue, the epistemological darkness is inevitably connotated with the literary topos of the love wound. Saint-Preux complains about his love pain as follows. Je vois qu'avec effroi, quel tourment mon cœur se prépare. Je ne cherche point à flatter mon mal. Je voudrais le haïr s'il était possible. Tare ici, s'il se peut, la source du poison qui me nourrit et me tue. Je ne veux que guérir ou mourir. Oui, je promets, je jure de faire de mon côté tous mes efforts pour recouvrir ma raison, ou concentrer au fond de mon âme le trouble que j'y sens naître. Soyez, hélas, une autre que vous-même, pour que mon cœur puisse revenir à lui. Similar to a spring, the wound seems to have somehow unconceivable yet powerful potency that spreads contradiction and perturbation, and in this rejects any logical pattern. So Saint-Preux feels curiously nurtured and killed at the same time. The tumultuous workings of the wound act deep in his heart and seem to remove the ground of Saint-Preux's being, so that he loses certainty about his own identity, but later he accentuates that love for Julie provides him with this higher destination of being and letting him find himself. The wound, as we can read it in the letter to Julie, suggests a so-to-call real starting point of his love, an origin which seems to be lost forever, like the reality prior to writing. The described wound itself is only the lasting trace ex post, the so-to-called love wound, of the so-to-called love wound, that is itself a trace of the so-to-called falling in love. And the described wound is a sign of mere negativity, a material or paper signifier which cannot be signified definitely, but whose meaning is always in process or progress, involved in the never-ending escape from actually being a meaning. I tried to illustrate this in this slide. We have the described wound in the text, which is only the trace of the so-to-called real love wound prior to the text. And the laugh wound itself is, again, only the trace of the so-called laugh or original union prior to the text. So we have here a dynamic of mise en abîme. The text tries to mirror or to simulate the laugh wound. And again here another dynamic of mise en abîme, as the laugh wound in this area here tries to mirror and to simulate the laugh union again. So we have different dynamics of mise en abîme working here. And in my notion of protocol, I refer to the Derridian notion of the quasi-transcendentalisme, which means that there is no real reality, no transcendental reality out of the text. There's only the text reality we have access to. And the quasi is the moment of dissimulation of this real reality. And on this point of view, and given some prescribed for salvation, the described wound can be regarded as a mise en abîme, not only of love or laugh wound, but of the whole letter corpus that has been written out of the pain of love, born out of the laugh wound, as Gilles states in the third part. Et ce qui devait vous faire taire fut précisément ce qui vous fit parler. Vous écrivîtes. Also the moment or the action from Saint-Preux to escape from her produces a very contrary, engenders the production of signs and letters. Yes. Then I have another. I hope you will look at this. It's only a summary of what I have taught now, but suggesting this so-called causality of loving and writing the text indicates the essential moment of its own anatomy. Obviously, the wound wants to be healed. The lost origin shall be regained and receive substitutive or supplemental meaning. Love wants to be expressed in order to re-establish or create the virtual and predestined union between the lovers. Yes, but the letters try to make up for the loss of meaning, though they cannot be anything more than the subsequent trace of love and a supplement to the reality that is implied in the first moment. The letters between the lovers therefore necessarily contain a rhetorical dimension of unreliability. They constitute a zone of unconceivable or obscured meaning. The written word never means what it seems to mean. Rather, ambiguity is omnipresent, the abysmal dynamic of fleeing semantics which absorbs meaning, rejects sense, and generates different readings. And the obscure semantics of the letter might be, as I will conclude in the second part of my lecture, the actual level of communication between the lovers and their inter- and extra-diegetic addressees, the hiding place of their passion in a paternalistic society which endeavors to build up a regime of visibility, perfect virtue, and evident truth. So, I come to my next point, which would be a short summary of the theoretical impact, the theoretical input on the issue of the rhetoric of the letter. I choose, it's Derrida's notion of the supplément as developed in De la Grammatologie from 1968. And Dieulgevusche's Confession, Derrida introduces the notion of supplément, referring to the author's attempt to withdraw from the public world and to represent himself exclusively through the written word. The supplément plays on the opposition between present of speech and representation in writing, as well as of speech and writing, parole, écriture. Among the many observations Derrida makes regarding Rousseau, I will focus on three aspects which seem to be relevant for our context. First, there is the potential for mimicry in the supplement, or something like a dramatic aspect, a simulating aspect, also mimesis, and I will skip this. We see l'écriture. I might take one sentence here. L'écriture est dangereuse dès lors que la représentation veut s'y donner pour la présence et le signe pour la chose même. He also mentions une ruse artificielle et artificieuse pour rendre la parole présente lorsqu'elle est en vérité absente. The written word that works as a supplement has no positive meaning that could be made evident under the transparent surface of the signifier. Instead, the written word only pretends or simulates the presence of meaning and tries to let us forget about its mimic character. The supplement is thus, due to its opaque nature, dangerous. And according to Derrida, Rousseau admits that there is a dynamic of semantic escape in the word itself. It's a dérobement dans la parole même. And this simulating moment of this supplement validates the permanent withdrawal of meaning into an achievable abîme, and so it's important for my context of the epistolary novel. For this simulating moment corresponds with the rhetorical nature of the love letter and its fatal nature to simulate the presence of love by recreating the abysmal love wound as a textual dimension. Writing the letters can never reach the origin. The endless chains of supplements provided by the text are interlinked and knotted, shifted and mirrored in permanent oscillations. And this constitutes the unconceivableness of the text and evokes its abîme. The supplemental dynamic deceptively mirrors or feigns the love object which actually has already escaped elsewhere. So the second aspect of Derrida's exploration of supplement, which applies to my argument, is the unselfish desire that informs the supplement in writing to reconstitute the presence of speech. Le désir de la présence naît de l'abîme de la représentation de la représentation. Le désir de la présence porte en lui le destin de son inassouvissement. With respect to Julie, the desire for meaning or representation of love seems to be the basal motivator, not only on the level of the histoire, but also in the structural sense. The desire for supplemental meaning is the decisive moment of semantic vitality that affects the conceptual level of the text and adopts it as a refuge for rejected passion. Third and finally, Derrida mentions a blocking frame, an interdiction which interrupts the natural expression in speech, so that supplemental writing becomes necessary. Quand la nature, comme proximité à soi, vient à être interdite ou interrompue, quand la parole échoue à protéger la présence, l'écriture devient nécessaire. Elle doit d'urgence s'ajouter au verbe. In the context of Julie, this blocking frame is obviously incorporated in the social hierarchy and the requirements of the ideology of virtue and paternalistic authority. So, and another notion I want to present here in the referring the theoretical impact is the notion of obscurité developed by Markus Köhlen. Köhlen develops the notion of obscurité to describe the phenomenon of semantic opacity as seen in Proust as a very unreachable point where conceptual meaning is intermingled to such a degree that it is densely and indissolubly knotted, as in Derrida's abîme, as engendered by the supplement. So this would be here describes it. I skipped this because of time. So the mentioned aspects are developed by Derrida and Söhlen, and they are of realistic value for my argument because they deliver the frame for developing my argument. And I will deepen the aspect of blocking. I will now deepen the aspect of the blocking system Derrida alludes to, and which I mentioned above as the regime of visibility created by a paternalistic society. So I come to the point handling the aloneness of love in the regime of visibility, dissimulation and mask. To go further in the argument here and to illustrate the generative function of the ideology of virtue regarding central aspects of the romantic mind, we have to explore the problem of confrontation between the abysmal obscurity as implemented in passion on the one hand and the structure of the narrated world, the world Julie and Saint-Preux live in, on the other. This confrontation is insinuated in Julie's reaction to Saint-Preux's love. Ô Julie, je le vois avec amertume, mes plaintes troublent votre repos. Tout décèle à mon cœur attentif vos agitations secrètes. vos yeux deviennent sombres, rêveurs, fixés en terre. Quelques regards égarés s'échappent sur moi. Vos vives couleurs fanent, une pâleur étrangère couvre vos joues. La gaieté vous abandonne, une tristesse mortelle vous accable. Julie's response to Saint-Preux's blind passion implies a secret reality, namely that of the disturbing love wound which works as agitation secrète. Julie's being in love, however, does not gain a conceptual value of its own, but is stated exclusively by the effects on her behavior. These effects evolve metaphorically as a darkening or a shadowing of vital substance, such as Julie's usual vivacity and cheerfulness, into dream and mournfulness, as well as a darkening of her open view that is also deviated. The love wound is thus present ex negativo, but undeniably initiating a dynamic of absorbing vitality, of alienating familiar meaning. The effects of the wound obviously insinuate a reality of dissimulation. From Julie's side, she obviously intends to hide the disturbing secret of having a love wound and of its darkening effects from her environment. And of course, Julie has to hide her trouble because it is incompatible with the paternalistic society represented by her father, Bartholin d'Étanges. The strategy of hiding dissimulation and mask is born out of the fact that the paternalistic society establishes a highly vigilant regime of visibility around the notions of honnêteté and bienséance. These social values, considered as truths, inform the untouchable words of Détain's authority to block the passionate love of his daughter to a non-aristocratic man, once critically stated by Bomston as la parole irrévocable. The paternalistic society is also attributed as having permanently open eyes and ears. It is obsessed with regarding and interpreting signs by using indexical codes, en soupçon, en conjecture, en nomme. Julie also often refers to her position with respect to her parents as sous leurs yeux, and emphasizes the danger for her and Saint-Preux if they would stay together in the country. Du moins, on aurait soupçonné. L'indiscrète avidité d'une prison nous ôtait toute ressource pour l'avenir. The question of how to handle the semantic alternance of love within the regime of visibility and in light of its moral codes structures the central conflict in Julie. The fact that the legitimation of passionate love can be noticed as that powerful structural reality in the novel indicates the insatiable desire of the protagonists to communicate their feelings to each other by any means to provide their abysmal love wound with supplemental meaning. In this respect, substitutive places are to be found where the obscured semantic of love as required by the love wound can come into its right and thus gain a reality. These substitutive places represent the essential moments in the topographical structure of the histoire as formed from the letters, where the obscure passion is exposed to the reader. Such places are, for example, the little forest where Saint-Preux and Julie have their first kiss, or the Jalais near the source of near the spring of the Vervaise, for example. And significantly, these places in the narrated reality give secret room to the semantic fluctuation of obscurity. These somehow abysmal places are evoked by different means as in-between zones, whose topography seems to have adopted the character of thresholds, declaring the ambiguity of definite functions, times, and states of mind. Yes, and for example, others chalet, yes. The chalet, usually serving, as an example, the chalet usually serving as a place for hunters, is attributed the additional function of a love nest, the dairy maids turning out to be matchmakers who are familiar with the love secret. And Julie adds another intertextual layer by introducing Montesquieu's Temple of Cnide, the very place where two separate lovers come together under Venus's protection. So these substitutive places have been explored extensively also by Starowinsky. I won't go deeper into that, but my question is how obscurity of passion can gain a rhetorical dimension in the text, and I will continue on this track. And the first step would be to look closer at Julie's dilemma at the end. And so I come to my next point. At the end of reality, Julie's dilemma as a platform for obscurity. The conflict in Julie comes to a decisive moment when the paternalistic authority ends the real relationship of Julie and Saint-Preux in the first part. The dispute between the Baron d'Étang, Julie's mother, and Julie herself illustrates the ethical values that the father promotes as a mouthpiece of society, and that is l'honneur d'une maison. The father's role is to maintain order, which is undeniably connected to his notion of honor and obviously threatened by Julie's unnatural relationship. The last phase of the dispute illustrates the potential violence of this social system and its regime of visibility. The darkening dynamics of passion and blind furor seem to invade and undermine also the prominent pattern of sensibility, such as the harmonious love among all family members. Just as in the pattern of virtue, a turning point is inscribed in the plain evidence of paternal love in its so-called perfect form of overwhelming care for the daughter, with the result that the concept starts to oscillate unpredictably between tenderness and hidden cruelty. At the same time, the potential for violence, as illustrated, serves to affirm the untouchable authority of the father's words and to build the very tragic moment which is Julie's dilemma. Because of their potential cruelty, Baron d'Étang's irrevocable words are empowered to create a new reality. They figure as a performative speech act that definitely finishes the relationship between the two lovers and interdicts the natural speech, the parole, between them in real encounters. Je vous défends de le voir et de lui parler de votre vie, et cela autant pour la sûreté de la sienne que pour votre honneur. So, in this dilemma works, or the dilemma is the platform for obscurity. Julie looks at the past and looks at the past as she was looking from an alienated outside on the threshold at the happy time which she had with her parents, as well as her happy time with Saint-Preux, not knowing which one of the two periods is over. And Brissot depicts a situation that cannot easily be forced into the categorical order. It's a dilemma. That is a darkened situation that cannot follow in logical channels, becoming clear, evident, and captured by the forces of light for reason. All the procedures usually acting in the regime of visibility. In the dilemma and its contradictory, indissoluble nature rather exerts the power of obscurity, the spring-like, self-refuting dynamic of giving and escaping signification. But obscurity here handled more than an epistemological parameter, not so much as a parameter to describe the affective universe of the protagonists. Obscurity turns out to be an epistemological parameter and is also articulated as a kind of dumbness or blindness, the inability to find the way out of the dilemma or to deduce an evident result, indicating the validity of abysmal ambivalence. So Claire states here, referring to the situation Julie is now in, ici quelque partie que tu prennes, la nature l'autorise et le condamne, la raison le blâme et l'approuve, le devoir se tait ou s'oppose à lui-même. In this dilemma, it seems significant that yes. In this dilemma, it seems significant that Julie rejects Bomston's offer to follow him to Yorkshire and marry Saint-Preux there, where no social prejudice would prevent them from living out their destiny for each other. That would simply be too easy a solution for us. Instead, Julie's rejection of the obvious legitimation of her love empowers the narrative space that illustrates how she manages within the regime of visibility, how she finds supplemental meaning as required by her love wound to validate the darkened semantics that love needs to communicate itself. The dilemma finally engenders Julie's decision as expressed in her letter to Bomston. Va donc, douce chimère d'une âme sensible, va te perdre dans la nuit des songes, tu n'auras plus de réalité pour moi. This decision can be regarded as a performative speech act that corresponds to her father's performative speech act that forbade her love in actual presence or reality. Julie's appeal empowers the dynamic of a transformation process. It can be understood as an attempt to domesticate the abysmal dynamics by forcing it into legitimate concepts. The transformation process is initialized in Julie's apostrophic address of passion as mere imagination, chimère, a significant change of concepts that activates the dispersing of love from the interfictitious reality and entitles it to the dark area of dreams. Julie's apostrophe thus implies a conceptual transformation in the course of which the unconceivable semantics of passion are transferred into imaginative areas of ontological diffusion, such as dream, but also remembrance, mournfulness, and nostalgia. On the semiotic level, this transformation process means that obscurité gets into the scope of notions that already and legitimately provide semantic diffusion by the concept itself. To this transformation process, Saint-Preux refers in his complaint after cherishing Julie's amulet that brings him back the mere illusion of her presence. Aux douces illusions, aux chimères, dernière ressource des malheureux, ah s'il se peut, tenez-nous lieu de réalité. Vous êtes quelque chose encore à ceux pour qui le bonheur n'est plus rien. Passion that cannot gain value in reality reaches out to these thresholds of consciousness as its resource that, mostly implementing the time factor, provide passion with a kind of legitimate afterlife. These threshold states do not dispose of a substance of their own, but are states between rational categories and patterns of evidence, grey zones of mere semantic relativity that are nourished from a past original experience. That way, the presence of love and unconceivable passion is revalidated in a legitimate conceptual outfit. And to exemplify the process of this transformative sublimation, I would like to go deeper into the scene at Meillerie in this letter. After the turbulent boat ride over Lake Geneva, Julie and Saint-Preux are forced to land at Meillerie. This place is depicted as containing a special signification for Saint-Preux because he stayed there 10 years before as an expatriate after he had to leave Julie's home. The letter, thus introducing two time levels, describes Saint-Preux's attempt to reunite the past passion and to validate it in the presence of the actual encounter with Julie by using the metonymical power of the place. But Saint-Preux's attempt fails. The failure illustrates not only the deviating dynamic of the conceptual transformation that passion has to undergo, but it also shows the contours of the shadow of passion and its pre-romantic appearance. It seems significant in this letter that the letter experiences the particular textual outfit of the passion once experienced there, as a monument des anciens amours. Saint-Preux presents Julie's monogram on the trees as an erratic lettering that seems to incorporate her. Furthermore, the verses of Petrarca and Tasso are written all over the place, and finally there are the trees and the pebbles integrated in this process of producing the textuality of love and thus gaining a semantics of writing material. This focus on the textual dimension of love seems to point to the deeper intention of the letter, namely its contextual and structural culminating point, the exposure of the abîme of meaning, as enacted by the obscurity of love and of its trans-temporal power. The affirmed textual dimension of love indicates the very supplemental character of love as a written letter that forever attempts to regain the fleeting semantics and thus is necessarily involved in the differential dynamics of a permanent mise en abîme, an endless postponement of the final meaning into mirror-like reflections. Saint-Preux's insatiable desire to provide the love wound with abysmal supplemental meaning is then projected towards his natural environment. He tries to transfer the abîme of passion into the abîme in the real landscape, and he confronted this real abyss near his writing place once. Voilà le bord où d'un œil avide et sombre je mesurais la profondeur de ces abîmes. The attractive power of the abyss requesting meaning and at the same time abolishing it, this devouring source-like abyss seems to have a seductive force on Saint-Preux's Saint-Preux to experience the fascinating anéantissement of all meaning, which might be experienced as a kind of freedom, the freedom from the necessity of being meaningful and readable at any means, and finally to deliver oneself to death, the anéantissement of all meaning. The metronymical power of the place is then evolved to engender the threatening situation of a re-entering of the attractive abysmal passion into the actual present. Saint-Preux's encounter with Julie on the second time level. He remembered the intense attraction of their beam, and Saint-Preux approaches it anew on the second time level as in an involuntary attempt to validate its abysmal dynamic, to validate abysmal passion immediately. But significantly, Julie intervenes. So I have here this citation. Mais Julie, qui me voyant approcher du bord, s'était effrayée et m'avait saisi la main, la serra sur mon dire, en me regardant avec tendresse et retenant avec peine un soupir. The de-escalation of the situation is due to the performative force of Julie's former speech act that expelled passion from reality. For in the regime of visibility, there is no real place for unconceivable love. From this perspective, Julie's gesture is not a sign of tender love, but is rather to be understood as a deviating gesture that turns the exposed passion into a legitimate conceptual afterlife, illustrating Saint-Preux's words, ces temps heureux, ces temps heureux ne sont plus, et nous vivons. The detour that Julie initiates is the starting point of the transformative process that the concept of love undergoes in the latter sense. Rousseau depicts a scene in which several attributes indicate the upcoming romantic setting and state of mind. This setting seems to be generated as a result of the fact that unconceivable passion is not allowed to live in visibility, in reality, but cannot die either, and thus adopts and appropriates the arms of reality that are provided legitimately by the notion of semantic delusion and ambiguity, daydreaming, remembrance, and melancholy, shadowed negatives of passion as condemned to live in limbo on the very threshold and at the margin of bright reason. In this context, referring to Le Tourneur, one of the first interpreters of Romantisme in late 18th century, Monglot signifies the romantic as l'incommunicable dans les impressions, mostly of a landscape, and leads it to the state of melancholy. This state catches the very escaping moment between present and past, implying remembrance and developed as the painful impression of the vaguely conjured afterlife of former happiness. The pre-romantic perception is marked by this experience of not being allowed to live the unconceivableness of affects or of love, and cannot help but project this desire to the outside nature, to the landscape. The pre-romantic perception implements structures of infinity, of abysmal obscurity in the landscape. Obscurity, as Monglot points out, seems to be inherent in the contact immédiat avec un lointain passé. The romantic perception develops the mystère of the landscape. By imagination, the romantic remembrance engenders the dark semantic reverse of a euphoric outer datum that even raises melancholy and tristesse. So I have chosen one passage from Rousseau to illustrate this. Insensiblement, la lune se leva, l'eau devint plus calme. And this is the end of the letter, after the Julie and Saint-Preux have left their beam. Insensiblement, la lune se leva, l'eau devint plus calme, et Julie me proposa de partir. Je lui donnai la main pour entrer dans le bateau, et en m'asseyant à côté d'elle, je ne songeais plus à quitter sa main. Nous gardions un profond silence. Le bruit égal et mesuré des rames m'excitait à rêver. Le chant assez gai des bécassines me retraquant les plaisirs d'un autre âge, au lieu de m'égayer, m'attristait. Peu à peu, je sentis augmenter la mélancolie dont j'étais accablé. Un ciel serein, les doux rayons de la lune, le frémissement argenté dont l'on brillait autour de nous, le concours des plus agréables sensations, rien ne put détourner de mon cœur mes réflexions douloureuses. The essential elements of the scene, as presented in Saint-Preux's letter, seem to be anticipated in Jean-Marie Morel's Théorie des Jardins from 1776. Monglot has extrapolated these attributes, indicating a pre-romantic landscape that disposes of a mysterious character, such as solitude, calmness, and deep sentiment. The parameters of infinity projected or inscribed into the structure of those mysterious landscapes, indicated by the permanent flowing of water, of a river or a creek, but also by the oscillating of moonlight on the surface of water, as well as the hiddenness of the place that is at some point shielded from an outside area. So there's also an illustration of this scene already in Romanticism. And there is the moonlight and also the atmosphere here illustrated. So I want to now go deeper into this aspect of the rhetorical dimension of the text and its strategies to provide the possibility of refuge for the unconceivable passions, because we have seen that this transformation process of sublimation works still on the conceptual level and presupposes the intact concept, the concept of the text. There are concepts which are to substitute for passion. These are melancholy, but there's still another dimension, the text, rhetorical dimension, which is also used as a refuge for unconceivableness of passion. And so I have to go deeper into this problem with Volmar, under Volmar's Œil Vivant. The regime of visibility is continued after the marriage of Julie's marriage with Volmar in his house. And there is a union between the three after Saint-Preux has returned to Clarence. The holding of hands establishes the regime of visibility with Volmar at its very center, validating complete openness and authenticity, and the banishment of any secret or mystery. There should be accomplished transparency of all actions, thoughts, and hearts. And this transparency also anticipates the ideology of present and transference that informs the relationship between Julie and Saint-Preux. So Saint-Preux points out, je commençais de connaître alors à quel homme j'avais affaire, et je résolus bien de tenir toujours mon cœur en état d'être vu de lui. So Volmar, the doctor-like observer, is the unavoidable third between the two. But there's also a third between to be understood as a pathway for the rhetoric of the letter. Saint-Preux refers to a third between him and Julie that can open another perspective. J'aspire toujours à voir un tiers entre nous might allude to the Derridean verb of the supplement, which means for the unsatiable desire effectuated by the lover to gain supplemental meaning and to be communicated to the beloved despite the system of evidence and blocking its penetrating force. The undeniable third party might then indicate a hidden pathway for the darkened semantics of love in the heart ontology of Volmar's evidenced reality, a third between the concepts that are explicitly evoked by the written text. This third dynamic might be created by the letter text, by its writing strategies, but is not readable as its literal evident meaning, au pied de la lettre, that would be within the visible scope of Volmar's reading eye. Instead, this third might be a mere voice, not tied to a corporeal letter body, but lacking a semantic substance, existing as a mere relation between evoked concepts, a shadow-like phenomenon of obscurity, a glimmering moment, or a semantic ambivalence. So I remember also this statement of Saint-Preux. Tout ce que je sais très certainement, c'est que si mes sentiments pour elle n'ont pas changé d'espèce, ils ont au moins bien changé de forme, que j'aspire toujours à voir un tiers entre nous. Also there is no changement in quality, but a change in the form. And so then the passion might be the same, but it changed its form. It's somehow getting a phenomenon. The spectre of unconceivable passion flits through the text, not being the opaque third between writer and addressee reader, constituting the essential level of communication in the rhetoric of the letter. From this point of view, Saint-Preux's fright after his nightmare is significant as it reflects the scepter-like phenomenon of obscurity on the level of the histoire. This is the illustration after Saint-Preux's veil dream. The lover's past passion seems to be transferred to a kind of afterlife and surrounds him like a demon complaining about his lost existence. Yes. À ce dernier réveil, ma terreur fut si forte que je ne la pus vaincre étant éveillée. Je me jette à bas de mon lit sans savoir ce que je faisais. Je me mets à errer par ma chambre, effrayée comme un enfant des ombres de la nuit, croyant me voir environnée de fantômes, et l'oreille encore frappée de cette voix plaintive dont je n'entendis jamais le son sans émotion. Je m'enfuis de ma chambre. The implementation of the isotope of the spectre anticipates the generative dynamics as effectuated by the paradigm of visibility. The hidden forces of unconceivable meaning not allowed in the regime of visibility and its ideology of evidence, visible truth and reliability of the heart all survive as textual phenomena. So, there's another point, for example, Julie's trace of love, virtuous renouncement and empowerment of their being. There's the official reading of this virtuous renouncement of Julie of her love for Saint-Preux is that it is a renunciation of self-denial. Oubliez vos aimables projets et qu'il nous reste de traces qu'au fond d'un cœur trop reconnaissant pour en perdre le souvenir. Passionate love is overcome and has left behind nothing more than a mere trace. On the other hand, this trace is treacherous as it actually indicates an empowerment of obscurity by mise en abîme. The trace necessarily associates a love wound that itself a trace of the initial falling in love, and that is the original motivator of the whole letter writing as a mere trace. The written letter figures as a mere signifier that requires endless signification. So Julie's act of renunciation turns out to be an act of empowerment, actually, that validates the wound and legitimates a lecture that focuses on ambivalences, the very moments in which to the unconceivableness of love and its abysmal obscurity a refuge is provided. So I have So, as an illustration, as an example for this rhetorical dimension of the text, and I have chosen Julie's Élysée. From the very beginning of his letter, Saint-Preux tries to stylize the garden as a secret place that blurs the categories of time and space and introduces the visitor into a different reality that reflects a kind of illusionary space, like a spectacle. On the one hand, the spectacle as accessible in the garden is the spectacle of nature. Julie, the main creator of the garden, with Volmar's assistance, has carefully fashioned and corrected nature by cultivating the meadows and planting the trees. The purpose is to reveal the unique variety and innocence of nature exposed in the arrangement of domestic plants and the composition of garden flowers and wildflowers. Saint-Preux's letter uses expressions of admiration and disbelief regarding the thoughtful gardening plans that seem to be born out of the innocence and selfless love and respect for the sublime natural order, modeling the spectacle of virtue and mere naturalness having come to its right. In Saint-Preux's detailed description of the Élysée, however, another semantic dimension can be extrapolated that darkens these first attributions. To explore this dimension of the text, let's have a closer look at the following passage. Je me mis à parcourir avec extase ce verger ainsi métamorphosé. On y voyait briller 1000 fleurs des champs, parmi lesquelles l'œil en démêlait avec surprise quelques-unes du jardin qui semblaient croître naturellement avec les autres. Je rencontrais de temps en temps des touffes obscures, impénétrables aux rayons de soleil comme dans la plus épaisse forêt. Ces touffes étaient formées des arbres du bois le plus flexible dont on avait recourbé les branches, prendre en terre et prendre racine. Dans les lieux plus découverts, Je voyais çà et là le genêt et le trifolium qui paraît la terre en lui donnant l'air d'être en friche. Alors seulement je découvris, non sans surprise, que ces ombrages verts et touffus qui m'avaient tant imposé de loin n'étaient formés que de ces plantes rampantes et parasites qui, guidées le long des arbres, environnaient leur tête du plus épais feuillage et leurs pieds d'ombre de fraîcheur. Vous concevez bien que les fruits ne s'en trouvent pas mieux de toutes ces additions, mais dans ce lieu seul, on a sacrifié l'utile à l'agréable. Even if Saint-Preux accentuates his enthusiasm in experience the cultivation of the vineyard, his description of accomplished nature contains irritating moments that germ in essential concepts and seem to lead to another level of meaning, revealing a different spectacle performed by the Élysée. The legitimation of this level is brought along by Saint-Preux's own words at the end of his letter. Il, l'Élysée, me peignait en quelque sorte de l'intérieur de celle qu'il avait trouvée. Je pensais qu'avec une conscience agitée, on n'aurait jamais choisi ce mot. This remark reveals the supplemental layer that underlies the description of the Élysée and draws the attention to the hidden voice that Saint-Preux has heard in this garden, and that he wants both Bumston and the reader to hear by reading this letter. It is Julie's inner voice that reflects her inwardness as expressed by her garden arrangements. Her arrangements carry essential information about her own nature that has been artificially cultivated as well. In her marriage to Volmar, Julie seems to be happy. She seems to grow quite naturally, but aren't there some dark bushes in her heart that cannot be clarified by any effort? And isn't this darkness based on her pain of being curbed, of being adjusted to the moral and cooperative requirements of society that legitimates itself as a natural order? Julie has been forced to put down roots, a quite foreign soil that is not her intimate affection. Her inner life is thus similar to a wasteland that lacks water, in particular the vital dynamics of passionate love. Volmar's reality is alluded to in the ombrage vert et touffu. Saint-Preux was impressed by them, but having a closer look, he discovers that these plants are mere parasites operating on vital nature. Isn't this irritating moment operating in Volmar's work too? He seems impressive at first sight due to his decency and didactical care, but his omnipresent order observation and create paradoxically the suffocating reality of a prison. Julie suffocates in his open house as its relentless transparency eliminates her personal freedom and integrity. Implying this violent aspect of being obliged to the official natural order, of being adjusted as Volmar's wife, Julie documents her struggle several times in her letters. For example, in the second part and also sixth part, so on étouffe de grands passions, rarement on les épure. Quand il les faudra plus étouffer, on n'aura plus à les craindre. And Julie learned that her husband has read all her correspondence to Saint-Preux, that she is completely seen through by him. Experiencing the destructive moment of Volmar's confidence in her virtue, she confesses to Claire her inner state, that it is being shorn of personal integrity and self-confiance. J'ai perdu le droit de compter sur moi, et je n'ose plus me fier à rien de ce que je vois, ni de ce que je sens. Virtue is the prescribed nature for her, from which she cannot escape. Julie sacrificed her whole life to transparency. She's about to become completely transparent, curiously changing into a scepter. As shortly illustrated here, the supposedly harmonious depiction of an artificially ennobled nature is disturbed by the dysphoric impact of correlating concepts that reflect Julie's inwardness in other letters within the multi-perspective scope of epistolary. By lexematic or isotopical correlations as delivered by the isotopic correlations, the attributes that describe the garden are ambiguated. This conceptual disorder or oscillation in several feeds of meaning is to be considered of the undermining dynamic of obscurity as implemented by the discourse of Penguin that raise the interdicted voice in the supplement. The last one communicates itself ex negativo as a trace-like disorder of concepts. The disturbing voice that constitutes the essential level of communication between Saint-Preux, Bumston, and the reader rises out of the narrowness of Julie's suffocating existence. Bumston, who has always been highly interested in Julie's destiny for Saint-Preux, seems to the writer the dignified agency to understand the hidden message so that Saint-Preux's words themselves start to oscillate in a new perspective. For the pretended Élysée, the pre-romantic garden, performing Julie's inner tragedy and correlated to her inner universe, on n'aurait jamais choisi ce nom-là. So I come to my last point. Sorry about the time. I'm still... okay. Jamais vous ne la reverrez, le voile, Julie naît, Julie's death, or the phantom of virtue. The undermining dynamics of obscurité as effectuated by the Lafond dominate the whole part of the novel that deals with Julie's marriage and life with Volmar. As a result, like the accomplished nature of the Élysée, Julie's virtue remains ambivalent. Julie's personality as transmitted by the text seems curiously distant. Her virtue lacks substance or reliability. A bitter aftertaste remains when reading Volmar's assuring passages, a certain unreliability of the letter that tries to make Julie's accomplished nature believable. The reader cannot help but wonder if there might be a whole reality behind these literal assurances, unexpressed by the word, but being transmitted as a kind of hidden being, an unconceivable reality of otherness, and that feels like suffocation, pain, and death. The undermining dynamics of obscurité have changed Julie into a kind of scepter. In this context, the revival of Julie after her official death is also significant. It accentuates the ambivalence of her spectre-like existence between life and death. This trait, the status of passion as a state between life and death, is also followed by Saint-Preux's last letter that evokes a scar in his heart as an ambivalent sign that characterizes his own existence after Julie's marriage and while living in her house with Volmar. The scar indicates the vanished or the vanquished passion, as well as its unvanishable having been, the unvanquishable fact that it had existed, giving passion a kind of afterlife in limbo between life and death. The afterlife as a powerful trace, however, a sceau respecté, that crucially structures Saint-Preux's actual life, as he can never love again. In the end, only Julie's voice remains, the thin voice of a scepter out of the grave, that a horrified Claire seems to hear quite clearly. Claire, oh ma Claire, où es-tu? Que fais-tu loin de ton ami? Son cercueil ne la contient pas tout entière. Julie, entombed in the grave, has achieved ultimate distance. She cannot be reached by any means of signification, and this curious distance is caused by her unwed passion. Her passion cannot be eliminated, but must continue to live as a scepter-like phenomenon that is always around her, like a veil that cannot be removed, and that is the veil of death, the complete anéantissement of all meaning. Le voile redoutable me couvre, nulle main ne peut l'écarter. From this point of view, the inner cleft as transmitted by the text within Julie's attitude facing her own end between a pious disdain of death and a strange otherness that seems to welcome death, leads to the supplemental meaning of the protagonist's pretended sacrifice, her sudden jump into the water to save her son, which is at first sight an act of selfless maternal love. But this reading remains ambivalent, for by absorbing the many convulsions of her life and inner universe as documented in detail by her letters, Julie's death is constructed as a concept whose signification loses itself in the abysmal obscurity between virtuous sacrifice and the voluntary act of self-liberation, recalling the unfathomable folds of virtue around her heart. Une voile de sagesse et d'honnêteté fait autant de repli autour de son père qu'il n'est plus possible à l'œil humain d'y pénétrer. This obscurity can be attributed to the disturbing and accusing voice of passion. The dying Julie actually sacrificed herself to virtue and has not sacrificed herself out of virtue. The virtue as prescribed by her by Volmar hasn't cured her but has killed her. As she feels imprisoned in her transparent existence, death seems to be the only, thus fascinating way out of the transparent world of complete evidence. Is she finally dedicated to death as a provider of the fascinating freedom of meaning? From this point of view, she might have succumbed to the spring-like water and plunged herself into their being, following its siren-like voice. Thank you very much.